This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. To pre-order Aetherdrift, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my draft guide for Aetherdrift. So far I've evaluated every single card in the set, and in this video I'm going to take a look at each of the color pairs and discuss what their main point of synergy is. This isn't a video where I'm going to take a look at cards that are just really good in all decks, like bombs or premium removal, unless those cards happen to be particularly good in a specific color pair. Instead, I'll be looking at the various cards that help each color pair do whatever it is they're trying to do. If you want to know my thoughts about the cards more generally in the set, that's what the set review is for, so check that out. Alright, let's get started with our first color pair, which is black-red. It's one of the speed color pairs. There are two of them, and these are built around kind of the headliner mechanic of the set. These aren't the only two color pairs that have max speed, but they're the two color pairs that are the most into it and built for abusing it. Every color pair in the format has two signpost uncommons, a signpost uncommon being a card that is exactly those two colors at uncommon rarity, which really tells you what you should be doing in that color pair. And you can see from Gastall Thrill Seeker, a 2-mana 2/3 that has Start Your Engines, which means whenever an opponent loses life during your turn, if your speed is 1 or greater, increase your speed by 1, max speed is 4. This ability triggers only once each turn. So as soon as you play a card with Start Your Engines, you start to track your speed for the rest of the game. Gastall Thrill Seeker dying doesn't stop you from gaining speed. So any card that can help you start your engines early, like a 2-drop like the Thrill Seeker, is definitely the kind of thing that you want. And the Thrill Seeker is extra good because it also has an enters trigger that deals 1 damage to your opponent and you gain 1 life. That means if you play this on turn 2, you're already going to be at speed 2 because the Start Your Engines thing happens, and then the Thrill Seeker does 1 to your opponent, triggering Start Your Engines for the turn. And it has a max speed effect, and these are all effects that you get when you have speed 4. In this case, it has Death Touch and Haste. So in the later stages of the game, it is a really obnoxious attacker. And in the early stages of the game, it's a great enabler for all of your max speed stuff. The other signpost uncommon is a vehicle, and every color pair has one vehicle as a signpost uncommon. This one is Apocalypse Runner, and while it doesn't have speed anywhere in the text box or Start Your Engines, it does have an effect that helps you do it because you can tap it to make a creature with power 2 or less gain lifelink until end of turn, and it can't be blocked this turn. So you can send creatures in to raise your speed, in addition to it being a reasonably beefy vehicle. So how do you go about consistently reaching max speed apart from these two signposts? Well, there are cards like Packdoll Terror, which has a trigger that drains your opponent 1 life anytime an artifact you control enters, so that can help you get there. Risky Shortcut makes both players lose 2 life when you draw cards, and so that means if you cast it on your turn, you get some speed. You can also use things that are like tricks, like Burner Rocket, which gives a creature +2/+0 and trample until end of turn, makes it more likely that it's going to get in and raise your speed. You've got Dynamite Diver, which pings things when it dies. You have Magmakin Artillerist, which you can cycle to help you with max speed because it does 1 damage when you cycle it. And once it's in play, you can start discarding cards, which includes cycling, to do 1 damage to the opponent. It's also important to just have cheap cards that get you started, like the Thrill Seeker. You know, you've got stuff like End Rider Catalyzer, which starts your engines on turn 2. And you even have some lands with Start Your Engines, like Avishkar Raceway, which theoretically can get your engine started on turn 1. The one thing I don't love about all of the lands that have Start Your Engines, though, there's one at common, uncommon, and rare, is that they all really hurt your mana base, and their max speed effect isn't that great and limited once you get there. So I don't love these, but if speed is really good, those lands are probably going to be better than I expected in the set review. And there are a lot of cards with max speed, but I would say most of them at lower rarities just have effects that make them a little bit better. But there are a couple in black-red that are like legit win conditions that I think are going to be key cards for these decks to go off, and those are Risen Necro Regent and Endrider Spike Spitter. They both have really powerful max speed effects. The Necro Regent spits out a 2/2 zombie token at your instep, and Endrider's Spike Spitter lets you exile the top card of your library, and you can play it that turn at the beginning of your upkeep. So they both give you like a full card of value at every single turn from their max speed effect, which is incredibly strong. And I think like in an ideal world, you have like 1 copy of each of these or better in most of your max speed decks for it to really feel like you're getting there on winning the game with max speed. You can also just like curve out, obviously. That's what this deck wants to do. Curving out is a good way to get max speed. You don't have to do anything fancy. And so, you know, this is also an aggro deck, but it has this potential where even if your opponent somehow manages to stabilize, cards like the Necro Regent and Spike Spitter make it pretty impossible for them to win. Rares that fit in this color pair include Far Fortune End Boss, which has Start Your Engines. Anytime you attack, you get to ping your opponent, so it helps you get max speed. And when you have max speed, it makes all of your sources of damage do 1 more damage. You've got Gas Guzzler, which is a 1-drop with Start Your Engines. Black and red don't have any 1-drops at lower rarities with Start Your Engines, but obviously that's really good. Playing a 1-mana 2/1 that gets the clock started on speed is pretty great. That's like exactly what you want to be doing in an ideal world. It has a nice max speed effect too, where you can pay a black and sack another creature or vehicle to draw a card. Burnout Bastronaut is a 1 red mana card that starts your engines, and it has Menace, so it's even better in most ways than Gas Guzzler at helping you raise your speed. It can also buff itself for 2 mana, and it has a max speed effect that gives it double strike. There's also the Speed Demon, which is a huge demon with flying and trample with Start Your Engines, and draws you a bunch of cards and makes you lose life depending on what your speed is. And there's also Hazaret Godseeker, which, like other Amonkhet gods, can't attack or block unless you meet some requirement. In this case, you've got to have max speed. Luckily, it has Start Your Engine, so it can get you started on turn 2, and it has an ability that can send in creatures unblocked if they're small enough to help you get your speed high enough. So that's black-red. It's a fairly aggressive max speed deck. The other speed deck is less aggressive, and it's black-white, and Wizards calls this speed attrition, which I think overall just means that this deck is a lot slower. It's about cards that create multiple bodies on the board, which both Embalmed Descendant and Dune Drifter do. Embalmed Descendant has Start Your Engines, and it makes a 2/2 black zombie, and its max speed effect is pretty sweet because you get to drain 1 life every time you have a creature die. And Dune Drifter is a vehicle that lets you reanimate something from your graveyard, so you get the Drifter and then this other body as well. There's a little bit of graveyard stuff, a little bit of sacrifice stuff going on in this color pair, so it's more of like a value speed deck as opposed to like an aggressive one. The ideal ways to help you reach max speed at lower rarities include the Ascendant, but also Leonin Surveyor, a 2-drop that starts your engines, has first strike when it attacks, or during your turn actually, more generally. And that means, especially if you play it on 2, it's pretty good at getting in for a hit and helping you raise your speed, and it also has a decent max speed effect where you can exile it from your graveyard to draw a card. Nesting Bot is a 1-drop that has Start Your Engines at lower rarity, something that black-red doesn't actually have access to. I mean, I think overall we saw that black-red's a lot deeper when it comes to cards that Start Your Engines and ways to raise your speed quickly, but Nesting Bot and Leonin Surveyor are both really good ways to get your speed started that have kind of built-in ways to help you. In the case of Nesting Bot, it gives you multiple bodies, which always increases your chances of getting in for a hit. And then you also have Pack, Doll, Terror, and Risky Shortcut. Again, a lot of the max speed payoffs are like Nesting Bot, where the creature just gets a little bit better, or like Leonin Surveyor, where it gives you some value later in the game. But there are 2 really good ones, once again including Risen Necro Regent, and the other is Pride of the Road. It's not quite as good as the Necro Regent or the red uncommon we looked at, but once you have max speed, you do get to start giving one thing double strike every combat on your turn. And it has Vigilance too, which is pretty good at helping you keep your opponent from getting to max speed. So these are sort of the premium max speed payoffs you're going to want in this particular color pair. Rares that work out well here, well, we've got Zahur Glory's Past, who has Start Your Engines as a 2-drop. He can sack creatures and you surveil 1. And he's got a very powerful max speed effect. Anytime a non-token creature you control dies, you get to create a tap 2/2 black zombie creature token. So his sack ability starts to spit out a token too in most cases, which is really strong. Perilous Snare is just like a great removal spell with Start Your Engines that when you get max speed is a free way to put counters on your stuff, which is really strong. We've got Gas Guzzler and the Speed Demon again as well. All right, so those are the 2 color pairs that are most into the speed mechanic. Black-white is sort of a grindier deck that wins longer games with max speed, whereas black-red is sort of a curve-out deck that can just end the game with max speed. Let's move now into the 2 vehicle/mount-oriented color pairs. Again, every color pair in the set is into vehicles, but some of them are more into it than others, like red-white, where you have a signpost uncommon like Cloud Spire Coordinator, 2-mana 3/1 that when it enters you scry 2, and when you tap it, you can make pilot creature tokens one for each mount and or vehicle that you had enter the battlefield under your control this turn. And these pilots are extra good at crewing and saddling vehicles. That's a pretty powerful ability because once the coordinator can't attack or crew or whatever anymore, you can just start using it to spit out a token every now and then. I do want to note that, it's not just vehicles, it's also mounts, but red-white is more into vehicles than it is mounts, whereas green-white, the other sort of vehicle color pair, is a little more into mounts than it is vehicles, but most of the payoffs overlap. The other signpost uncommon here is Cloud Spire Sky Cycle, a vehicle that when it enters lets you put 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 other target vehicles and or creatures you control. This does mean you can put a counter on 2 different things or 2 counters on 1 thing, so it's a pretty powerful effect that's usually going to be able to get full value out of the counters, in addition to being like an easy to crew vehicle that can get in the air. So what are the vehicle payoffs at lower rarity in red-white? Well, in addition to the Coordinator and Sky Cycle, you also have Alacrian Armory. This is one I'm a little skeptical about because unlike the Sky Cycle and Coordinator, it doesn't really do hardly anything on its own. Giving +0/+1 in Vigilance to your whole board isn't really worth a card, but it does have an effect that lets you saddle a mount or crew a vehicle, basically, for free every turn. You don't have to crew or anything like that. And that has the potential to be really powerful. Obviously, crewing a vehicle for free is usually better than saddling for free because mounts are already creatures, right? And vehicles aren't, so it's a much bigger upgrade to turn something that isn't a creature into one for free than it is to just sort of make a creature better. But either way, it is an effect where if it works, this and green-white are the decks where it's going to work. There's also Canyon Vaulter, which when it saddles a mount or crews a vehicle during your main phase, it gains flying until end of turn, and that's pretty good. Lots of mounts and vehicles are pretty big. Cloud Spire Captain is a mount and vehicle lord, and it can also saddle mounts and vehicles as though it has 4 power, which means it can saddle and crew almost everything. Daring Mechanics, a 3-mana 3/3 that can put counters on mounts and vehicles. Interface Ace, like Alacrian Armory, a card I'm a little bit skeptical of, but it does have the capacity to saddle mounts and crew vehicles twice per turn because anytime it becomes tapped, it untaps, but it only triggers once each turn. I think it's probably a little too one-dimensional, just like Alacrian Armory is, to be great, but again, if it does work out, this is where it'll work. Tune Up lets you bring back an artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield, and if it's a vehicle, it becomes an artifact creature, period. In other words, you never have to worry about crewing it again. It's always going to be a creature after you tune it up. Dynamite Diver is another one of these creatures that can saddle mounts and crew vehicles as though its power were 2 or greater. Push the Limit, this is yet another one that I'm super skeptical of, and I'm the most skeptical of it, of these 3 cards I've mentioned that I don't love. It lets you reanimate all of your mounts and vehicles from your graveyard, and they gain haste, and then they all become artifact creatures, and then you sacrifice them all. So it takes a ton of setup and a ton of mana, so it's probably not going to work out very well in Limited, but again, if it does, this will be where it works. Reckless Velocitor is a creature that when it saddles a mount or crews a vehicle, gives it +2/+0 and trample. Road Rage is one of these premium removal spells that'll be good in any deck because its baseline is 1 mana for 2 damage, and other decks are going to have mounts and vehicles. But in this deck, it's most likely that it's going to be able to do 5 or 6 in the later stages of the game because you're going to have so many mounts and vehicles. Spire Mech Cycle has an exhaust ability that requires you to tap another untapped mount or vehicle, and when you do, it becomes an artifact creature, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it from each mount and or vehicle you control. So that effect is already really strong because it's usually going to mean it's at least a 6/5, and you don't have to crew it anymore, but sometimes in this deck it'll make it even bigger. Guidelight Matrix replaces itself, and then it gives you the ability to saddle mounts for 2 mana and turn vehicles into artifact creatures for 2 mana. It's a card I don't love, but it's another one that will work out pretty well in this particular deck if it works anywhere. Rares for this deck include Colodin, Triumph Caster, who gives all your mounts and vehicles haste, and when they enter, your mounts all become saddled until end of turn, and your vehicles become artifact creatures until end of turn. So that's pretty good. A lot of them have great stats, especially vehicles, and if you have a turn where you don't have to actually saddle or crew them, on top of also having this body in play that gives them haste, this is going to create some pretty crazy curve outs sometimes. Salvation Engine gives your other artifact creatures +2/+2. This is a more vehicle-oriented one, obviously, because mounts generally aren't artifacts. And when it attacks, you can return artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield. Chandra has the ability to animate a vehicle for free every turn. She also has a 0 ability that makes a token vehicle, and she can give up artifacts in play to draw cards. And Lifecraft Engine becomes effectively a vehicle lord because you name a creature type and then all your vehicles gain that type, and then it gives +1/+1 to all creatures with that type. So it's going to buff your other vehicles in addition to buffing a creature type of your choice. So that's red-white. It is a vehicle/mount deck where it leads a little more into being into vehicles than mounts. And green-white, like I've already said, is a deck that leans a little more into being about mounts than vehicles, but both decks like both things. Lagarin, Soul of Alakria is one of the signpost uncommons here. It is a mount. And when it attacks while saddled, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target mounts and or vehicles. Can put a counter on itself, so you're always going to get at least 1 counter, and it will frequently in this color pair have somewhere else to put the counter. There's also Veteran Beast Rider, a 3-mana 3/4 that untaps your creatures at the beginning of your end step. This makes it easier for you to saddle and crew things because you don't have to worry about your creatures staying tapped. You can also buff your whole board. So what are the mount/vehicle payoffs? Well, we've got Alacrian Armory, Canyon Vaulter, Cloudspire Captain, Daring Mechanic, Interface Ace again. In addition to those and our 2 signposts, there's also Rise from the Wreck, which gets better if you've got a nice mix of mounts and vehicles, because it lets you return up to 1 target creature card, up to 1 target mount card, up to 1 target vehicle card, and up to 1 target creature card with no abilities from your graveyard to your hand. Potentially it can return 4 things. It's not usually going to. Returning 2 is okay, and it'll be able to do that in this deck, and you'll frequently be able to return 3 as well in the later stages of the game. And there's also Run Over, a really good removal spell that becomes even cheaper when you target a mount or vehicle with it. Rares that work well here, well, there's Caradora, Heart of Alakria, who tutors up a mount or vehicle when she enters. She's also into +1/+1 counters, and that is a sub-theme in green-white, even though it's not all over the place. It is part of the identity of green-white, so you can often, like if you tutor up the Soul of Alakria, that's a pretty good combo, and obviously those 2 cards go together. And then there's also Salvation Engine and Lifecraft Engine as well. So those are the 2 vehicle-oriented/mount-oriented color pairs, red-white and green-white. Red-white is a little more aggressive, while green-white is more of a mid-range deck. Let's move now to blue-white, which is more generally about artifacts and not just vehicles. Our signpost uncommons here are Voyage Home, a draw spell with affinity for artifacts, so you just want to get a lot of artifacts in play. And Guidelight Pathmaker, which is a 6-mana 6/5 vehicle, and when it enters you can tutor up an artifact and put it into your hand. And if you grab one that has mana value 2 or less, you can just put it directly on the battlefield. Other artifact payoffs at lower rarity other than the signposts include Guidelight Synergist, which gets +1/+0 for each artifact you control. Tune Up again, which can reanimate artifacts. You're probably not going to have as many vehicles as red-white, but you're also more likely to have a game go long enough for Tune Up to be good and have stuff in your graveyard more often than red-white does. There's also Voyager Quick Welder, which decreases the cost of your artifacts. Gearseeker Serpent, which comes with affinity for artifacts. Memory Guardian, which comes with affinity for artifacts. Guidelight Optimizer, which can tap for mana that can be spent on artifacts. And Transit Mage, which can tutor up artifacts with mana value 4 or 5. Rares that work well here include Mendicant Core Guidelight, which has power equal to the number of artifacts you control. Also has Start Your Engines and Max Speed. Whenever you cast an artifact spell, you can pay 1 generic. If you do copy it, that effect's really strong. This deck isn't exactly super into max speed, but obviously it can get there. He's going to be a pretty good card when you've got a bunch of artifacts. Once again, we have Salvation Engine. In this deck, it's more likely to be buffing your regular creatures than it is vehicles. Either way, it's going to be pretty strong. So this color pair is kind of a tempo artifact deck where you want to play cheap artifacts to power out things with affinity for artifacts and stuff like that. The other color pair is blue-black, and as you'd expect, it's generally a grindier, slower artifact deck. Although, one of the signpost uncommons here is a little bit interesting. It's one of these that doesn't really scream signpost uncommon in the same way that most do, and that is Haunted Hellride, which is a 3-mana 3/3 vehicle with crew 1, and whenever you attack, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains death touch until end of turn. untap it. That does seem a little bit out of place, but it is a really strong card. It's going to give you a pretty effective attack every single turn, and obviously that's good. It's just weird it doesn't have anything to do with artifacts, whereas Haunt the Network does. The other signpost uncommon, it makes 2/1/1 Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying. Then your opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So if you get a bunch of artifacts into play and cast this, it's going to be huge. And the baseline is 5 mana for 2/1/1 flyers and drain your opponent 2 life, which isn't terrible. Other artifact payoffs include Packdoll Terror, which we saw before. It drains your opponent a life anytime it or another artifact enters. Chitin Gravestalker is like a graveyard-oriented payoff, which is probably going to be better in black-green, which we'll see later, but it does like it when you have artifacts or creatures in your graveyard. It becomes cheaper. Hellish Sideswipe gets better when you have like expendable artifacts like tokens to sacrifice. Wickerfolk Indomitable can be cast from the graveyard if you pay 2 life and sacrifice an artifact. And then you've also got all of the blue payoffs we saw, like Deerseeker Serpent, Memory Guardian, Guidelight Optimizer, and Transit Mage. Rares that work well here include Winter Cursed Rider, who gives all of your artifacts ward, pay 2 life, and it has a powerful exhaust ability where you exile X artifacts from your graveyard, and each other non-artifact creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. So if you get a bunch of artifacts in your graveyard, he can potentially be a sweeper. And then there's Demonic Junker, which is a really powerful vehicle that like paying 7 for would make it already still a pretty good card, but it has affinity for artifacts. And so it's going to come into play, kill your opponent's best thing, and potentially get rid of something that you don't need anymore to make Demonic Junker even better. So that's blue-black. It's an artifact deck, kind of a grindy one that bleeds your opponent out. Now let's take a look at the 2 Exhaust color pairs. Exhaust being a mechanic that is new in this set, which you can actually see on Winter here. And an Exhaust ability is one you can only use once. So you've got Ranger's Aether Hive, a 3 mana 3/5 Vigilance vehicle with Crew 1. And whenever you activate an Exhaust ability, it makes a 1/1 colorless Thopter token. So that's a pretty great payoff for exhausting. Meanwhile, the other signpost uncommon is a solid creature with an Exhaust ability where you can pay 4 generic, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal 2 land cards. You put those onto the battlefield tapped, and it gets a +1/+1 counter. So you can see how exhausting when Ranger's Aether Hive is in play is going to feel pretty insane because you're getting a pretty good effect out of the Seeker already. So what are the exhaust payoffs other than our signpost uncommons? Well, Guidelight Optimizer slots in here too. It can pay for activated abilities in addition to paying for artifacts. So it helps you pay for exhaust. Ranger's Refueler is a vehicle with exhaust that can also draw you a card when you exhaust. Elvish Refueler breaks the rules about exhaust by letting you use exhaust abilities as though they haven't been activated. You can only do it 1 extra time per turn. It's not like you can do it infinitely. And it has its own exhaust ability. Pit Automaton can tap for mana to use unactivated abilities, and it can even double exhaust abilities with another activated ability. Rares that work nicely here, well, you've got Afterburner Expert, a great exhaust card that is also an exhaust payoff because it comes back from your graveyard directly to the battlefield anytime you activate an exhaust ability, and just adding a 4/2 to the board is a huge upgrade. You know, getting a 1/1 Flying Thopter is nice, getting a 4/2 is even better. Mind Spring Merfolk is a rare with exhaust. Same thing with Loot the Pathfinder. It does require red mana, but you don't need that much fixing to splash Loot, and Loot is really strong because it can Ancestral Recall and Lightning Bolt things with its exhaust abilities. And there's also Sita Varma, Masked Racer, who has a powerful exhaust ability that buffs her and changes the base power and toughness of all of your creatures. So that's blue-green. It is an exhaust deck. Red-green is also exhaust. It's a more aggressive version of exhaust, as you would expect. You've got Boom Scholar, a 3 mana 3/3 that makes your exhaust abilities cost 2 generic less to activate of your other permanents. And that matters because it also has its own exhaust ability, which puts 2 counters on it and gives your board trample. And you've also got Rocketeer Boost Buggy, a 2 mana 3/2 that makes a treasure when it attacks. Treasure can help you pay for more expensive exhaust abilities. And it has an exhaust ability itself where it becomes a creature and gets a counter. So what are the other exhaust payoffs in red-green? Well, you've got the Boom Scholar, you've got access to the Refueler again, as well as Pit Automaton, and there's also Adrenaline Jockey. This is pretty much it, though. Red-green doesn't seem as into exhaust. Like, a lot of the value of Exhaust in red-green is just that it has these effects that make your creatures better at instant speed that you can use like once, as opposed to like really grinding out value with Exhaust like blue-green seems to want to do. The rares, again, you've got Afterburner Expert. You've also got Redshift Rocketeer Chief, which can tap for mana to spend on abilities, and it has its own Exhaust ability that lets you put any number of permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. That ability, not great in limited, just because you rarely, by the time you have enough mana to pay for the Exhaust ability, are going to be like, yeah, I have a bunch of cards in my hand. Loot's good here, too. Again, you can splash it. Draconautics Engineer is a really great Exhaust card because it sort of scales all game long. You can effectively play it as a 2-mana 2/2 or a 3-mana 3/3, and then later in the game, you can also get a Dinosaur Dragon out of it. And of course, you can also just pay this in installments, and you can do it all at instant speed, which is great. There's also Boom Mobile, which has an Enters trigger that gives you mana that can only be used on abilities, and it has its own Exhaust ability that you can just pump that mana into. So that's red-green. It is an Exhaust deck. Now, the two remaining color pairs we have are both kind of interested in discarding cards in the graveyard, but they are also sort of each their own thing. One of them is really interested in discarding cards, and that's blue-red. It's interesting here, you've got two Signpost uncommons that are enablers, but not actually payoffs for discarding cards. Boosted Sloop is a vehicle that anytime you attack lets you loot. That includes when you attack with anything. And Broadside Barrage is 3 mana for a 5 damage removal spell that also lets you draw a card and then discard a card. These two cards are both really good, but they're not actually payoffs for discarding. There are some of those, though, and kind of like we saw with the max speed decks, there's like two premium uncommons here that I think are going to make or break this deck a lot of the time. Those being Scrounging Skyray and Marauding Mako. They're both really cheap creatures that gain counters anytime you discard, which includes cycling. That's the most common way you're going to do it in this set. But you can also do it with all those loot effects, like the ones on the two Signposts. And yeah, if you play a Marauding Mako on one and a Skyray on two, one or the other or both, and just start cycling and stuff, you're going to end up with these huge threats that your opponent has to kill. Guidelight Optimizer, once again, slots in here because it can help pay for cycling. Magmakin Artillerist has cycling itself, and anytime you discard one or more cards, it deals that much damage to each opponent. Pit Automaton can also help you pay for cycling. The rares that work well here include Captain Howler, Sea Scourge. He's got a big payoff anytime you discard a card because he gives +2/+0 until end of turn for each card discarded. And if that creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to draw a card. Fearless Swashbuckler likes vehicles a lot, and it's got haste. And if you attack with a pirate and a vehicle, you get to draw 3 and discard 2, which will trigger your payoffs. Thopter Fabricator isn't actually a discard payoff, but a lot of the ways that you discard cards in this set involve drawing cards because you're either cycling or looting or rummaging, and anytime you do that, you get a 1/1 Thopter token. And Gasstall Thrill Roller is a 3 mana 4/2 trample haste vehicle that you can bring back from your graveyard once if you pay 2 generic and a red and discard a card. Then there's Monument to Endurance, which is a really powerful discard payoff. Anytime you discard, you either get to draw a card, create a treasure token, or each opponent loses 3 life. You can only activate each of those once per turn, but getting those effects is really strong, especially the draw a card and the opponent loses 3 life. It looks like a legit way to pressure your opponent. And then the last color pair is black-green. Like I said, it's got a little bit of cycling stuff on its own, but it's more into the graveyard than the actual act of discarding cards than blue-red is. You've got 2 Signposts and commons, of course. One of them is Broodheart Engine, which for a black and a green is an artifact that surveils 1 every upkeep, so it helps you load the graveyard, and it has an activated ability for 2 generic, a black and a green, that lets you reanimate a creature or vehicle from your graveyard. So you can see here how like the main thing you're going to want to do is cycle away something big and scary and then reanimate it. And the other Signpost uncommon is the exact card you want to do that with because it's Thundering Broodwagon, a 6 mana 6/5 Menace Reach vehicle that when it enters, destroys target non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value 4 or less, and it has cycling. So it's exactly the kind of thing you can bring back with Broodheart Engine way ahead of schedule. So what graveyard stuff is there? Well, there's really a lot of it. You've got other reanimation stuff like Back on Track, which is also good with Thundering Broodwagon because it lets you reanimate a creature or vehicle, and then you get a pilot token. You've got Carrion Cruiser, a vehicle that mills 2, and then you return a creature or vehicle from your graveyard to your hand. You've got cards like Chitin Gravestalker as well that check your graveyard for how many artifacts and creatures are in it and get better. The Gravestalker becomes cheaper. It also has cycling, and while it's not nearly as exciting to reanimate as Thundering Broodwagon, you know, you can throw it away early and then bring it back at a reasonable cost later. There's Deathless Pilot, which if you mill, you can get back later in the game. Grimbalble is going to be good in every black deck, but in this one you can leverage it even more because it comes with a Surveil effect, and putting it into the graveyard is itself pretty valuable. You also have access to black sacrifice artifact stuff. Mutant Surveyor has a max speed effect that lets you exile it from the graveyard to draw cards. Sheffet Archfiend is another one of these cards that you can cycle early and reanimate ahead of schedule. We've already seen Wickerfolk Indomitable. You can cast it from the graveyard. Dredger's Insight pays you off for having artifacts or creatures leave your graveyard by gaining you a life, and when it enters, it mills 4 and then can get back an artifact, creature, or land. Earth Rumbler lets you exile an artifact or creature from your graveyard to turn it into an artifact creature without crewing. Molt Tender helps you mill yourself and can turn milled cards in your graveyard into mana. Ooze Patrol mills 2 cards and then checks your graveyard for the number of artifacts and creatures and gets that many +1/+1 counters. We've already seen Rise from the Wreck. It'll work pretty well here because you're going to be the most adept deck in the format at milling yourself. What rares do you have here? Well, there's the very powerful Achik Emerald Radian, which gives you a 1/1 green insect when it enters for each artifact and or creature card in your graveyard, and then she likes it when those insects die. There's also Bloodghast, which if you mill it, you can bring back pretty easily simply by playing a land. There's also Crypt Caller Chariot, which likes it when you discard cards like the blue-red cards did. So, you know, you need cycling generally, which there's enough of in this color pair to really get it going, because it gives you a 2/2 zombie anytime you discard a card. There's Curse Cloth Wrappings, which I'm worried is slow, but if there's any deck for it, it's obviously this one. It buffs zombies, which you've got some of, and it gives creature cards in your graveyard Embalm, which sort of means you can cast them from your graveyard as tokens. There's Quag Feast, which is a great removal spell that gets better the more cards are in your graveyard. Once again, we've got Afterburner Expert, who, sure, you're probably not going to be as good at exhausting as blue-green or red-green, but you're going to have exhaust abilities, and it can come back from your graveyard. There is a Gonosaur Rex, which you can cycle early as a great combat trick and then reanimate later. And you've got Monument to Endurance if you happen to have enough cycling to really support it. So those are each of the color pairs in Aetherdrift and what they're trying to do, what their main points of synergy are. If this video was useful for you, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can find it useful too. If you're not already a subscriber, think about subscribing. And if you want to catch up on the rest of my set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.